Good morning. The committee will come to order. Before we begin our regular business, I do want to just make note of the passing of a former member of this committee, Ed Jenkins. This is a long-term member of the Ways and Means Committee, retired. Mr. Levin and I have discussed this, and so if we could just have a brief moment of silence in memory of Ed Jenkins. We're here today to consider H.R. 1173, the Fiscal Responsibility and Retirement Security Act of 2011. The bill, authored by our colleague Charles Bustani, repeals the Class Act, ending this program that even the administration has admitted is flawed beyond repair. The class program has long been a subject of concern. Simply put, the program is unworkable. One Democratic senator even called the Class Act a Ponzi scheme of the first order, the kind of thing Bernie Madoff would be proud of. The staff of the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the Department of Health and Human Services said the class program seems like a recipe for disaster. Since its inception, it was clear that the class program would add tens of billions of dollars to federal deficits despite claims to the contrary. The class program was designed to collect premiums for the first 5 years without paying any benefits, which of course made it appear as though the program would reduce the deficit. My colleagues on the other side pounced on this opportunity using this so-called savings for their health care overhaul. But everyone was aware that once the benefits started to be paid, the budget savings would quickly evaporate and the class program would become a drain on the federal budget. Less than a month after passage, the nonpartisan CMS Chief Actuary Rick Foster concluded there is a very serious risk that the problem of adverse selection will make the class program unsustainable. Over the next year and a half, the bad news continued. Health and Human Services officials hired private actuarial firms, convened day-long meetings of the federal government's best actuaries, and solicited input from outside stakeholders. And the conclusion was always the same. The program was not and could not be structured to meet a very important requirement, that it be fiscally sound and sustainable. Not once. In October of 2011, Health and Human Services Secretary Sebelius confirmed what we all knew all along and formally notified Congress that there was no viable path forward for the class program. In light of the fact that even its supporters in the administration have failed to find a way to make the class program fiscally sustainable, it must be repealed. Before the holiday season, the Energy and Commerce Committee favorably reported this legislation with a bipartisan vote of 33-17. However, the tax treatment of the class program falls within the jurisdiction of this committee, and as such, we need to act before sending full repeal of the class program to the floor. Few will argue with the assertion that long-term care is draining family and state budgets and that something must be done. However, the class program is clearly not the answer and could, in fact, do more harm than good. I'd like to recognize the author and champion of this legislation, Congressman Bustani, for the purpose of making an opening statement. But before I do, since this is the first meeting of the full committee prior to us leaving at the end of December, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge both Health Subcommittee Chairman Wally Herger and Human Resources Subcommittee Chairman Jeff Davis. Both have announced they intend to retire at the end of 2012, and although both of you will be with us for the remainder of this session, I want each of you to know how much we appreciate your time and your friendship and all of your effort on this committee throughout the years. And I hope that all of our members will join me in thanking you for all you've done as members of the Ways and Means Committee. Thank you. I now recognize Dr. Bustani.
Thank you, Chairman Camp. I'm very pleased that the Ways and Means Committee is considering H.R. 1173, bipartisan legislation to repeal the Unsustainable Class Act. I introduced this bill in March of 2011 with Congressman Phil Gingrey and Congressman Bill Lipinski, and we've gained more than 100 co-sponsors. The bill is quite simple. It repeals the Class Act as the program is fatally flawed, fiscally irresponsible, and irreparable. Last year, Secretary Sebelius suspended class after her own attorneys conceded she lacked the legal authority to make class appear more actuarially sound. I agree with employer groups and taxpayer advocates who have no doubt class will return if Congress fails to strike it from the books. Legal experts at the Congressional Research Service warn a federal judge could force HHS to revive class when the Secretary misses the October 2012 deadline for designating a final plan. Citing HHS, the Congressional Budget Office said, I quote, "The program cannot be operated without mandatory participation so as to ensure its solvency," end quote. And in fact, Mr. Chairman, I have the HHS report here, which I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record. Class is unsustainable and a new unfunded entitlement we cannot afford. Early in the process, CBO warned it would inevitably add to future deficits on a cash basis by more than it reduces deficits in the near term, even though the premiums would be set to ensure solvency of the program. It's also a bad deal for Americans who will need long-term care, with premiums projected to be as high as $391 per month, a price which far exceeds private market premiums, according to the Urban Institute's Howard Gleckman. Under class, consumers receive no private contract that guarantees benefits. They must meet a 5-year vesting period and forfeit what they contribute into a pay-as-you-go system with no reserve requirements. Mr. Chairman, as a physician, I have treated hundreds of patients who needed long-term care, including families with Alzheimer's disease. I've gone through this problem with 2 members of my family in the last few years. American middle-class families remain dangerously unprepared for these costs, thinking they have coverage that they do not. Some people will spend more than $100,000 on this care. The fictional class daily benefit of $50 per day won't cover these costs. Private long-term care insurance offers a better deal, and we should work together in a bipartisan way to make this easier to purchase and more affordable. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support class repeal, H.R. 1173. Long-term care reform is a bipartisan issue, and moving forward, we should make it easier for disabled Americans to save for future needs, expand access to affordable private long-term care coverage, and better educate Americans on the need for retirement planning. And there are options out there that we can work on. So I plead with our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, let's do the responsible and prudent thing, and let's also remember that being imprudent and fiscally irresponsible is no substitute for compassion. And I yield back.
Before I yield to Ranking Member Levin for his opening statement, without objection, I ask that all members' written statements be included in the record. Hearing no objection, Mr. Levin is now recognized.
Thank you. First, on a very sad note, I'd like to just say a word about Ed Jenkins, and I think there may be a further opportunity later on. Those of us who served on this committee with Ed remember him so fondly. He was a gentle but strong advocate. He used to like to come to the floor as well as speaking in this committee and say, "I'm just a poor little country lawyer," remember? And then he'd hit you right between the eyes. He really cared about this committee, not only its jurisdiction, but its character. And so, Mr. Chairman, I think we all join those especially who served with him in remembering a stellar member of this committee. I'd also, Mr. Rangel is here, who served with Ed throughout Ed's tenure. Also, I'd like, on behalf of all of us, to join in thanking Mr. Herger and Mr. Davis for their service and your continued service for the rest of this year. We've been privileged to work with you and to benefit from your intensive dedication. To put it mildly, we always haven't agreed on issues, but I think we've agreed on the importance of these issues. So let me just say a few words about the bill before us. I come forth with a very different emphasis. I think the proper emphasis should be the importance of addressing long-term care in this country. We have failed to do that, and the need is increasing exponentially. I think we know the average cost nationally of a private room in a nursing home is about $70,000. I think we also know that private insurance pays for only about 7% of all the spending on long-term care. I think we realize that about a third of federal and state spending on Medicaid, over $100 billion, goes for long-term care. So I think we should recognize that the Class Act represented an effort to address this challenge. It's clear it can't be implemented at this time, but I think instead of repealing it, we should work on replacing it. There's been reference here to the need for bipartisan action. I think, therefore, it's a mistake to proceed here on a basically partisan basis. I think also what we need to do is to remember that the overwhelming need in this Congress is not for more confrontation, but to seek common ground. And I think the effort to repeal, which is not going to occur, I think, in the Senate, is really the path of confrontation instead of seeking common ground. So far on the Republican majority side, there has been, as I understand it and look at it, 0 proposals that have been acted on to replace the Class Act. No one has come forth with a specific alternative.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I have a draft of legislation that is very near finalization, and I would be happy to share it with you and the other members of the committee for your input.
Good. Well, instead of voting to repeal, which is not going to happen, let's spend our time on the legislation.
And if the gentleman would yield once again, I would remind him that the administration itself has basically said we cannot make this work, and they're stopping it. The problem is that, as it is, if the courts could force HHS and the Secretary to implement a fatally flawed, fiscally irresponsible plan.
Okay, I think that's pure speculation. And instead of speculating about that, I think, again, we should sit down and work together and come up with something positive instead of here acting on the negative.
If the gentleman would yield just for one more point, that is not my speculation. That's the Congressional Research Services
But it's
analysis.
Still, it's speculation. And so I think what we need is to put our feet forward instead of trying to repeal something that has been placed on hold, that at the least was a symbol of the need to address this issue. It turns out that it is not actuarially sound. One of the problems is that it's voluntary. To replace it raises the issue of something that might be mandatory, which itself raises other issues. So instead of essentially going through the motions here and repealing something that at this juncture is not in a position to be implemented, we ought to, again, decide, work together on what might replace it. So my strong feeling is, let's not spend time on repeal. Let's spend our time on replacement. And you have expressed from your own practice the growing need to pay attention to this. Since the Affordable Care Act was put forth and voted on and passed, there has not been, as I understand it and see it, a single proposal put forth that would replace class. You're working on it. So let's work on it instead of going through further confrontation. I yield back.
Thank you. I just would also note on the CRS report on the legality of this, they're also concerned that the courts may invalidate large parts, and this is in the CRS report, so that you would have people with an expectation potentially of a benefit that would not be there. But yes, I'm prepared to go to Mr. Barthold to summarize the bill, and we could ask questions at that time. But why don't we move there? Mr. Barthold, Chief of Staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of H.R. 1173. I ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin. I'll be brief. H.R. 1173 has a very limited effect in terms of the Internal Revenue Code.
Mr. Barthold, if you'll suspend, I think I have to say the committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1173, which was distributed in advance, and without objection, the bill may be considered read at any point and open for amendment at any point. You may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Under the Class Act, it treated the Class Act program as qualified long-term insurance for purposes of the Internal Revenue Code, which generally meant that premiums paid could be deductible by individuals or deductible as a self-employed health provision. And it also generally meant that amounts received under contracts would be excludable from income. What H.R. 1173 does is it repeals those provisions that would treat the class program as qualified long-term care insurance. And as noted in the document that we prepared for the members, repealing these provisions would have no effect on federal receipts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just follow up on what Mr. Levin said, because I think he's correct in response to trying to find a bipartisan way forward here. And just as I do that, I also would like to offer a comment on Eddie Jenkins. And Ed Jenkins was as good a political figure as I served with in the House of Representatives, and he'd be a good lesson for the younger members of this committee. He was about as wily a guy as you were going to find. He was filled with good humor and a good nature, and came to many conclusions that indeed were bipartisan. With great humor, I remember him approaching me on the floor of the House of Representatives after he had taken a position that is almost unheard of these days, and that was contrary to his party leader on capital gains taxes. And not the argument over whether they should be higher or lower, but he saw me on the floor, and I said, "Eddie, how you doing today?" He said, "Well, I've taken a position on capital gains that has increased my name recognition with Mr. Rostenkowski." And I thought the way that he frequently handled those issues, whether it was the war in Iraq in '91, where he took a very decisive but difficult vote, but everybody who knew Ed Jenkins, you knew one thing that he did better than anybody: he mastered the code. He understood the ins and outs of the tax code, and he represented his constituents in southeastern America very effectively, but he was always a player. And part of the fact was due to his understanding that you were not here based upon the will of a speaker or a president. You were here to make sound policy. And I think the example that I would like to cite right now is something that's also unheard of. I worked hard with Nancy Johnson and Barbara Connelly to craft language on long-term health care insurance. And I understand the argument that it cannot be just a government program, and at the same time, you're going to need tax credits to make it affordable for the American people. The premium costs right now for asking somebody to lay out $5,000 a year, as cited in the statistical data earlier today, is indicative of the challenge and problem that we face on long-term care. You are going to have to use a preference in the code to encourage people to purchase long-term care insurance. So there is definitely a role here for government, and I think Mr. Levin is correct by saying, rather than putting something on top of, why don't we put something beside the proposal that's being offered? And I hope that we can find a path forward on that basis.
Mr. Brady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for bringing this bill forward. Mr. Barthold, thanks for joining us today. Mr. Levin made a key point that we ought not simply repeal but replace it. Are you familiar with Health and Human Services efforts over the past 18 months to identify alternatives that could make a program like this work?
Mr. Brady, I have read some of the reports that they've put out, but I should note that most of the program that they describe, and actually most of what H.R. 1173 is about, is not in my area of expertise. As I noted, it really has sort of a very small internal revenue code footprint, so I wouldn't claim expertise relating to the work that HHS has done in analyzing the program, but I am generally familiar.
My understanding is that HHS has examined at least 8 alternatives to the Class Act, all of which have failed the 75-year solvency test. In a sense, we have bipartisan support early with Senator Conrad and others who, before this became law, raised the fiscal unsustainability. We've had bipartisan concerns raised since the bill became law. Now we have the President's own agency searching for 18 months for a way to make this program work and admitting at the end it cannot. So it seems to me that the Class Act is spoiled fruit. Letting it sit around longer isn't going to help people get the care they need. And it seems to me there's nothing worse for someone who's hoping for long-term care to pay money into a program and then never get the help that they were promised. It seems to me, Mr. Chairman, the right action to take is to repeal the Class Act and the false hope it has offered, and to work together to find ways that we encourage more people to early on achieve their long-term health care needs with an insurance plan that works. I yield back.
Yes, Mr. Doggett's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 1 year ago this month, the House Republicans took over the Congress, and their first major action was to repeal the Affordable Care Act. They insisted at the time that they were not on a repeal-only course, they were on a repeal and replace course. And immediately after approving legislation to repeal the Affordable Care Act, they approved what I think was appropriately referred to by me then as the 12 platitudes. The 12 platitudes were included in a page-and-a-half bill to outline the steps they would take to replace the Affordable Care Act. Instead of action on the 12 platitudes over the last year, we've had mainly the sounds of silence, interrupted only by the Ryan Republican budget, which was designed to privatize Medicare and to significantly reduce the level of Medicaid investment, which provides much of the long-term health care coverage to individuals with disabilities and seniors in this country. I think it was not only repeal, but repeal and denial. Indeed, they're in a state of denial about the severity of this problem. Now we are told that there's a danger that someone might file a lawsuit over this piece of legislation. There is no lawsuit that has been filed, and indeed the very document to which my colleague refers, which was reported from the Congressional Research Service last November but only provided to us this morning, indicates there would be significant hurdles, to quote the report, to filing such a lawsuit. There's been no lawsuit, just as there has been no hearing in this committee or elsewhere on long-term health care, though we've had a year. There's been no lawsuit, just as there has been no legislation in this committee to deal with this health care issue or other health care matters that were included in the 12 platitudes offered as an alternative to the Affordable Care Act. Meanwhile, some provisions of the Affordable Care Act, though most of them will not become effective for a couple of years, are making real progress. Indeed, a report in this morning's Washington Post summarizing the findings of an employee benefit research report indicates that that group of Americans, young adults, who have had the least health coverage in the past appear to have significant gains under the Affordable Care Act. But the same analysis refers to another employee benefit research report that seniors, despite Medicare, continue to struggle. They were asked if to save money they had to make changes in prescription drugs or skip or postpone doctor appointments in order to pay their monthly bills. And about a third of them said they did have to make prescription changes, and over 36% said they skipped or postponed doctor appointments in order to save money. One of the biggest challenges to seniors, to individuals with disabilities, and to their families is the fact that when someone turns 65, there's about a 70% chance they will need long-term health care. And often it means bankrupting themselves and bankrupting their families in order to get that care. There have been initiatives in the past to try to address this concern, the one that Mr. Neal referred to. I introduced legislation at the beginning of this Congress to address this problem in the private sector, to set some minimum standards for private health care policies called the Confidence in Long-Term Care Insurance Act. We've been unable to get any action on it. It addresses, though, only a small part of the problem, because many of our seniors and individuals with disabilities cannot afford private insurance to take care of this problem, and we need some action as an alternative. I don't view the Class Act as a really well-done solution to this problem, but instead of repealing it and denying, we ought to be acting to modify it in order to address this serious long-term problem. It is a problem that costs thousands of dollars. The annual average cost of nursing home care in this country is over $70,000. That can destroy a lifetime of savings for both a senior and for family members that try to provide that kind of care. Medicaid is about a third of all Medicaid costs in this country are related to long-term health care. And to simply come in after a year of doing nothing other than to complain about the Affordable Health Care Act and to undermine some of the other health care services we have through Medicaid and attempt to do that with reference to Medicare and say, well, we're starting another year, so it's time to repeal a little more. That is not a way to address the legitimate concerns of families all over this country for health care security. We have made some progress in what is a very imperfect Affordable Health Care Act. I'll be the first to admit that, like this provision, other aspects are imperfect. I only wish that that Affordable Health Care Act were as good as our critics think it is bad. It is a modest but important step forward to address these concerns. We ought to use the Class Act as a way not to provide all of our long-term health care in the country, but as a way to focus attention on that problem, which should have been done during the last 12 months, and to try to move forward to address what is one of the most serious gaps in health care coverage in our country, long-term health care. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Well, I don't necessarily subscribe to every point the gentleman made. I do admire your seeming ability to call on a higher authority during the course of your remarks. I do want to correct something I had said earlier that that was a CRS report. It actually was the Health and Human Services report that I was referring to. Are there any further on this side? Yes, I'm going to alternate if there's anybody on this side that needs to inquire. All right. Mr. Thompson, and then I'll go to Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't believe that the repeal of the Class Act is in the interest of any one of us represent. As has been pointed out, the President has suspended this program. It's not going into effect. It's not going forward. Anything and everything is subject to a lawsuit. So if we start repealing everything that might go into the courts, we'd spend all of our time just repealing everything. So I don't think that's a good argument. However, the need to address long-term care is even more urgent today than when this bill passed over a year ago. So that's what we should be focusing on. Now, I agree with my friend, Dr. Bastani, on the fact that we need to be working in a bipartisan manner to figure out how we clear this hurdle of the need for long-term health care, and that's what we should be doing, not going through an exercise and repealing a measure that has been already suspended by the President. I'm glad that you have a measure. I'd love to see it. That's what we should be working on, not going through this political malarkey. And so I would suggest that we sit down, figure out how to solve this problem, and suspend, as the President has suspended the Class Act, suspend the politicking and get down to policy making. I yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Lewis is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to join you and others in saying a word about Ed Jenkins, colleague, member of this committee from my state. He was a wonderful and unbelievable prince of a human being. He was very helpful to me when I came to this committee and when I first came to Congress. It is my hope that we will have an opportunity to say something about him on the floor. Ed loved his work on this committee. He loved it. And from time to time, when we would have gatherings, I guess you call it Sandy and Charlie and Pete and others, Ed would always make it his business to return. And if we all could live the life that Ed Jenkins lived, this committee and our Congress will be much better. But let me just make one point about what we're doing today. Mr. Chairman, I must say that I think this is a waste of time. We have a long-term care crisis in this country. We should not be repealing the program. We should be working together to make the Class Act work. I think the American people are just sick and tired of the partisan fights. And when I was back in Georgia and traveling around the country, people said, work together, pull together, do something good. And I think that's what they want us to do. We should find a way to fix long-term care. But where are your ideas? Where's the program? Where's the legislation? I think this is a deliberate, systematic attempt to destroy the Affordable Care Act. And we shouldn't use this as another effort to make a down payment on destroying the Affordable Care Act. With that, I yield back my time.
Ms. Black has sought recognition, and I'll come back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I might begin by saying that one of my proudest accomplishments in the state legislature that I served in prior to coming here to serve was to reform the long-term care system. Tennessee was last in the country in services to our seniors on long-term care. And so I worked a number of years, I guess about 10 years before we finally came to a solution. And I couldn't agree with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that this is a very important issue when we have 10,000 seniors who are retiring every day, and we know that people are living longer and longer, and so a solution for long-term care is absolutely necessary. Likewise, when I first got here, because I had not read the Patient Affordability Act, it was one of the jobs that I felt I needed to do before I were to make comments on either repealing or replacing or whatever to the Act. And when I got to this part in the code, I was just stunned about the unsustainability. I knew, having worked on this so hard in my state, that this was a totally unsustainable program. All of us have in our packets a Class Act timeline. And I think when you take a look at this and you see that this started back in 2009 with our Chief Actuary, Richard Foster, in making comments about this being unsustainable all the way up to the period of time when it was passed, knowing it was unsustainable when it was passed. And then, since then, the comments by both Mr. Foster and also Secretary Sebelius, knowing that this was unsustainable. I believe we need to wipe this off of our slate, begin over again, not allow the people of our country to believe that there is a solution right there, because obviously, starting back in 2009, it was known this was not the solution. It still has not come forward. Our administration's not come forward with a solution, knowing that this was not sustainable. So this is a new day, and I believe that this is a message to the people of the United States that we are serious about wiping the slate clean and beginning again to look at a sustainable program. And I hope that both sides of the aisle will come together. I'm looking forward to Representative Bastani's solution to this. I am going to work with whomever comes up with what I believe to be a sustainable, workable solution to this issue. It is a huge issue, and it is one that is not going away. It's getting bigger every day. So I would say for today, we are putting a message to the American people that we are serious about starting over, wiping the slate clean, and coming up with something that really is workable for the future of our seniors of this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. McDermott's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The sole voice in the Republican Party that has made sense on the Affordable Care Act, it seems to me, was Bill Frist, who said a long time ago that if you don't agree with it, don't repeal it, fix it. We've sat here for 376 days on this committee. We have not worked very much. We've occasionally had a hearing on something. But we haven't worked on a single major piece of legislation in a year. Now, this piece of legislation clearly, I think to anybody who looks at it, maybe even from the beginning, had some real doubts about whether this was the way to go. But the fact of repealing it will let loose a blizzard of press releases. Affordable Care Act repealed. Obamacare receives another strike, or whatever. That, I can see them coming. I know what this is about. But the fact is that Americans have a big, big problem. Now, my mother and father lived to 93, my father, and 97 for my mother. And they were poor enough that they got to the end of the line without bankrupting their kids in taking care of them. Everyone up here on this dais has access to a federal long-term health care plan, which some of us buy at $300 and some odd a month because we think we might outlive when we're going to need some help. Some of you are gambling up here that you'll be, Mr. Doggett talked about 70% of the people wind up needing long-term care, and it leads to bankruptcy. I say to people in the district when they're talking to me about, well, we got to get rid of that Medicare and stuff, I say, when you see your mom and dad come over to the house and they come in the front door, imagine if they were coming to stay, that they were moving in because they didn't have Medicare and they didn't have Social Security. That's the way it was before 1964. And Medicare has been so successful in lengthening people's lives in this country that we now have a bigger long-term care program than we did 10 years ago. It's not only the United States, it's Japan, it's Germany, it's all over the world. The graying of the society and the need to deal with people who are living into their 90s, that's not uncommon anymore. It used to be if you knew somebody who was 80, you thought they were really old. Well, not anymore. And the fact that we are not dealing with it is why the people are restless out there. That's what Occupy Wall Street is about. It's anxiety about a Congress that does not deal with the problems. And repeal is simply, you know, it's another PR stunt. And I'm certainly, we'll all have fun with it. And I'm sure Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert and the other news reporters will have great fun with this stuff. But the fact is that the bill should have been here a long time ago. Everybody says we ought to repeal, but the problem of health care is not going away. A lot of you are sitting here waiting and hoping that the Supreme Court will say it's unconstitutional in July. Some state legislatures are acting responsibly and laying out a program to implement it. And I think that's what we all ought to be doing, is figuring out that the first attempt wasn't perfect, that there are things to be fixed, but where is the proposal? People talk about the proposal. Believe me, I'm not going to hold my breath till we see a long-term care bill in this committee, because we got people here who know it. Dr. Bustani, Ms. Black, they know the issue, but there's nobody putting the bill up on the board. I'm going to vote no, because I don't think we ought to send the message to the American people, it's not a problem. It is a problem, and we've got to work on it. I yield back the balance of my time.
I would just like to correct the record that I know the gentleman may not feel that trade agreements with Korea, Colombia, and Panama are major and significant. They only will create estimated 250,000 jobs in the United States. And those were items that were addressed by this committee in the past year. But let me just say, we have waited 2 years for the Obama administration to make this program work. We didn't rush out on day one and try to repeal the Class Act. We gave them some time to try to make it work. And they have told us they cannot make it fiscally sustainable or actuarially sound. Secretary Sebelius said, and this is a quote, she sees no viable path forward for class implementation, and she testified before the Senate, I would absolutely agree. Class is totally unsustainable. Now, given the report from HHS, which says there are two legal concerns, one, that if the benefits are paid, that a court could require that the Class Act be implemented, even though it's unsustainable, or second, could withdraw benefits from people who have an expectation that they're going to get long-term care. Either alternative is unacceptable and I think warrants that we move forward. And it's a fatally flawed program. Sometimes you can continue to write on the chalkboard, and sometimes you need to erase the chalkboard clean. And again, as Dr. Bustani has said, he is working on legislation in this area, has invited others to join him on that. And so with that, I believe we have Mr. Rangel who'd like to make a comment.
Chairman, there appears to be such a sense of cooperation, but also a commitment that we need a vote. But I just don't want those that knew Ed Jenkins to let this moment pass, because this is when you need a person like Ed Jenkins. You never, whether Republican or Democrat, you never challenge his commitment, his sense of humor, and his ability to find ways to get out of political situations where everyone can walk away with the committee and said, we won. I gathered from your last statement, and nobody can challenge you on your commitment to your country, to the Congress, and especially, Dave, to this committee. And we are fortunate that we have seen days with rough problems and how we worked our way out of it at the end of the day for the good of the tax code and the good of the Congress. But Dr. Bustani has a bill, and it appears as though Congresswoman Black and others are anxious to find something, not a Republican or Democratic solution, appear to want to fill this gap that has been there for so very, very, very long. I just wish, Mr. Chairman, that whether it requires a caucus or not, whether you have to have this vote or not, that we can find some language to say that ultimately we have made some type of commitment as a committee in a bipartisan way to deal with this serious national question. You will be the first to admit with me that sometimes, no matter how much we try to work together, the politics of the majority and the minority overwhelms our ability to get around certain questions. And I'm afraid this might be one of those things. But we'll be saying on our side, and I hope you will be saying, what would Ed Jenkins do? And if we could get that type of feeling that they are winners in this program and not politics, some kind of way, I think we all will walk away better members of the Congress. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And before I yield to Mr. Davis, I do want to say that considering this legislation today is important. It's timely and it's necessary. And the reason is that the referral to this committee expires on February 1st. And this another committee in the Congress has already acted on this legislation, as I mentioned in my opening statement, so that to protect the committee's jurisdiction, we must act as a committee on this bill. So there's a reason beyond the policy arguments that require us to act before our referral expires, because it would mean we would cede jurisdiction over this issue, which I know none of us on this committee would like to do. So, I did not know that. Yeah. So, Mr. Davis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't have the privilege of knowing Mr. Jenkins, but if he represents the character that everybody has shared about him, I think he would take a very principled and pragmatic approach to the Class Act. I don't doubt anybody's intention when the Class Act was forced through with the health care bill that was forced through with looking at underlying processes. We had private discussions about this. There was not a consideration that was taken when the Affordable Health Care Act, let alone the Health Care or the Class Act, was put in there to look at the secondary and tertiary effects of this legislation. I've had similar experiences dealing with my mother in her last 18 months of life, knowing the challenges of dealing with a truncated bureaucracy. But the problem with the Class Act is it is unsustainable, because the one thing that was never done in the Affordable Care Act, let alone the Class Act, was looking at the regulatory burden and the overhead that was already imposed on providers in our states dealing with long-term care or any other form of care. This fact drives cost. When you added the Class Act by reducing reimbursement, taking money out of the system to be set aside when it truly wasn't funded to work within that, is the reason that the Democratic Secretary of Health and Human Services stated the obvious: the Class Act is unsustainable. I have no issue with approaching a broad process reform orientation to dealing with long-term care, but the reason that Dr. Bustani's approach is the correct approach is because he's asking these questions that were not asked when this was put into law before. If we want to provide increased capacity for those who need long-term care, we don't need to put in place additional rules and regulations that eat up cost. We need to look at that, those cause and effect relationships, and I yield back.
I understand that Mr. Becerra and Mr. Bustani will be the last speakers, and then we'll move forward. All right, Mr. Becerra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's become very clear there's bipartisan support for trying to move something forward. I think there would be bipartisan agreement that this is a tough issue to deal with because the costs are high and they're unpredictable. You're talking about trying to help someone who is hoping to have as much as possible independent living and the best quality of life, but also has some impairments that make it very difficult for them. So I don't think there's any doubt that we all get it, that it's a tough nut to crack. But the facts are that long-term care insurance that's available today through the private insurance market is simply unaffordable. That's why so few Americans take advantage of it. About 80% of Americans cite the cost of long-term care insurance today available through the private marketplace as a reason why they don't get it, even though they may need it. And in less than 10 years, we know that there will be close to or somewhere around 15 million Americans who are going to need long-term care. Yet there are less than 3% of Americans who need it who have long-term care insurance today. The alternative is to essentially bring yourself down to the level of poverty so you qualify for Medicaid, so you'll get that assistance. And it seems then that what we should do is heed what Secretary Sebelius tried to say to us. She wasn't just saying to us that she could not find a way to implement this long-term care law at all. She was saying, I have a hard time seeing how we implement it today. And if you look at her letter, she says, I'm quoting part of her letter, I do not see a viable path forward for class implementation at this time. She didn't say at all, never again. She said at this time. And so I hope we'll keep in mind a couple of things. Saying no is not a solution to the long-term care needs of Americans. Repealing the law that we have today that says long-term care is important for us to consider to help make it affordable for Americans, repealing that does nothing to help Americans who need this care now or will need it in the future. And so, because we agree bipartisanly that we must solve this, because we agree that the current options are not affordable for Americans, perhaps what we can do is try to take some of the good ideas that Dr. Bustani has put forward, try to pull together some of the ideas that members have in the past put forward on this issue, and then come up with something so that rather than just say no, or to take us back to when we had nothing in the law to help Americans, we try to make better what may not be a perfect solution that was put into law through the Class Act. And so, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that Mr. Bustani has put in time and effort on this and cranked out some ideas. I hope that we all will do the same thing, but rather than take what we have in place in the law and infrastructure to give us a solution for long-term care for millions of Americans who need it, let's make it better. Let's build and make it better versus repeal it and end up with essentially saying no to Americans who need some care. With that, I'll yield back.
Mr. Crowley is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. You know, time is of the essence, and I just want to, if I can, point out you're correct in your statement that it was not day one on which you moved to repeal, the Republicans moved to repeal the Class Act. It was actually on day 19 of January when you passed H.R. 2, that if that were to have become law, it would have removed the Class Act. It was not day 1, but day 19 of January last year. Secondly, we've heard a lot about the effect of the Class Act and the Affordable Care Act that it will have on the deficit. Let me clarify, even with the Class Act implementation on hold, the Affordable Care Act still reduces the deficit by $124 billion over 10 years. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter in opposition to H.R. 1173 by the healthcare advocates, including AARP, United Cerebral Palsy, the National Council on Aging, as well as a separate letter in opposition to H.R. 1173 by Leading Age.
All right, thank you. Mr. Pascrell is recognized.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Baltoy, can I get your opinion on something? Taxpayer funds are specifically prohibited from being used to pay for benefits. Isn't that correct in the Class Act?
It's a voluntary, it was to be a voluntary program.
So we're not going to take the taxpayers' money to pay for this program, correct?
HHS was to collect the premiums and administer payments. They were not, it was not set up as tax provisions.
Thank you, thank you. Here's my second question. CBO estimates show that the class program provisions, I'd like your opinion of this, would, let me quote, would reduce the deficit by $70 billion over a 10-year period, 2010 to 2019. These estimates include $2 billion in savings to the Medicaid program. I would like to know your opinion of that. You agree, disagree? You have no opinion? You'll have to wait to get back to us? Or carrier pigeon, whatever. What is your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you a couple different options. Carrier pigeon not being available, but my colleagues did work with the Congressional Budget Office on estimates of the Affordable Care Act, including the Class Act provisions. And I think what you've pointed out is that some of the there are many interactions in the Affordable Care Act in the creation of the state exchanges, in the small business subsidies and a number of the other provisions, it has the effect of making some people who were not previously eligible for Medicaid may choose a Medicaid outcome, may choose to purchase insurance through the state exchanges, so may reduce the number of people on Medicaid, and essentially how people received some form of medical insurance or medical care shifted around, and I think that's reflected in the number you cited about the reduction in Medicaid.
I think that my conclusions are, and I'll be very brief, Mr. Chairman, I think President Obama cares. Number two, do you have any options, 2 or 3 options that you looked at so that the questions, which I think are legitimate questions that have come up on this particular part of the Health Care Act, do you think it would run better, be sustainable, and again, not dip into taxes as this does not? Because I hear the impression many times that this is going to cost us a lot of money, et cetera. It is prohibited. It's in the bill. The words are very, very clear. You cannot, this act is prohibited from being used to pay, the taxes are going to be used to pay for benefits. It's prohibited. So do you have any options to what is provided for in the Class Act as it now stands?
Well, Mr. Pascrell, as I noted earlier, a lot of the Class Act involves provisions that aren't Internal Revenue Code provisions. It's a much broader, envisioned as a much broader program, a lot of which is outside my area of expertise, so I'm probably not the appropriate person to ask for options.
And finally, do you think that what a person is going to have as a benefit, with $50 a day, do you think that, and we're not going to call on taxpayers to use that, this is going to be paid for by the premiums, isn't that correct, Mr. Balthon?
As was noted earlier, the outline set forth for the Class Act was to have a voluntary program to be administered by HHS of collecting premiums and paying benefits as an.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
As Mr. Bartold pointed out, I think it's really CBO that has given the analysis on the fiscal impact of the Class Act, and then their report said that after the initial 10-year period, they predict, and I'm quoting CBO, that this law would add to budget deficits by amounts on the order of tens of billions of dollars for each 10-year period.
Oh, yeah, I concur, Mr. Chairman. I was just noting that we did work jointly on that, and that there are many different pieces that shifted.
Dr. Bustani is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take this opportunity to respond to some of the comments that were made by our friends on the other side. I think we all understand, it's undeniable, there is a problem. It's a serious problem facing every family in this country. I went through it with my father, who did not have long-term care insurance. He passed away 3 years ago, and our family dealt with this. But many, many families across this country are unable to do so. It's a problem, and we have to fix it. But you don't fix a problem like this by creating a new unsustainable program on top of problems that we already have with the unsustainability of Medicare and Medicaid. That's not the way to solve that. This is not the prudent way to deal with it. And I thought a long time about this, about whether to attach language offering an alternative, and I'm still working on it. We haven't ironed out all the details. But I do believe this. If we repeal this now, it gives us an impetus to really move forward to solve this problem as a committee. And I'll say that we all know how hard it is to get anything done here. And sometimes you have to have a sense of urgency. And I think there will be a sense of urgency if we repeal this bill and then move forward to come up with a real solution to a real difficult problem facing every family in this country. Now, many of you have offered solutions in the past. You've offered bills, and they all have usable and workable ideas that we can put together. But why didn't that happen when we passed this legislation, when this Congress, or the previous Congress passed the legislation that created the new health care law? Why didn't all those ideas get incorporated? Instead, what we had was something that everybody knew was unsustainable for the most part. I talked to many of you on the other side of the aisle who understood that this class program, was unsustainable. And yet, it was put into the law. We can do better than that. And I think by starting today with a repeal, it will give this committee a sense of urgency to see a solution through the process to become law that will help every single American family in this country. And I yield back.
I understand there are no further questions. Are there any amendments to H.R. 1173? If there are no amendments, I will now recognize Mr. Herger for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 1173 to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. A motion is agreed to. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Herger?
Aye.
Mr. Herger, aye. Mr. Johnson? Aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Nunez? Mr. Teaberry? Aye. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Davis? Aye. Mr. Davis, aye. Mr. Reichert? Aye. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Aye. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach? Aye. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith?
You want to be my date? All right.
Mr. Smith, yes. Mr. Schock?
Doesn't matter. No.
Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Mr. Berg? Mr. Berg, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel?
No.
Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. Stark?
No.
Mr. Stark, no. Mr. McDermott? No. Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? No. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? No. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Pascrell, no. Ms. Berkeley? Mr. Crowley? No. Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, aye. Ms. Berkeley? Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 yeas, 13 nays.
There being 23 ayes and 13 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 1173 is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.